conquered the Aztecs, Cortez and Pizarro, okay? And you think to yourself, the Aztecs and the Incas were a sophisticated society, and they had millions of people. How did thousands of Europeans defeat a civilization with millions of people? Sure, they had steel, swords, and the Incas did not. They had guns, but they were single-load guns, okay? They had cannons, but thousands versus millions? How did they defeat them? Sure, they defeated them in battle, but smallpox killed the leaders of the Incas and Aztecs. And these were totalitarian societies the Incas and the Aztecs had. In other words, they did what the leader told them. Well, after the leader died, and also millions of their people died from smallpox, the soldiers basically just cleaned up the mess. They killed the rest of the people and they conquered them, okay? Because most of them were, and their leaders were dead from smallpox anyway. That's how the Spanish conquered South and Central America, okay? European diseases killed native people. And I've always had the question, okay, I get that, okay, different societies, different areas, different people. How come when the Europeans came to the New World people were killed by the European diseases? But why weren't the Europeans killed by diseases of the New World people? Basically, because there weren't any. Most all diseases, pandemic-type diseases, and especially the ones we've had lately, consider AIDS, SARS, MERS, Ebola, Marburg. These are all viruses that are called zoonoses. In other words, animal diseases. But different from the animal diseases that we've had in the past, like smallpox, okay? These animal diseases, these zoonoses are animal diseases, but they're not from domesticated animals. They're wild animal diseases. And they're wild animal diseases that people get through hunting and wild animal markets, like they had in Wuhan, okay? Smallpox, measles, influenza, TB, those were all diseases that were jumping from animal to man, but they were all diseases that jumped from domesticated animals, where the Europeans and Central Asians drank their milk, ate their meat, played with the babies, okay? Dogs, cats, okay? Domesticated animals. These new zoonoses, MERS, SARS, Ebola, COVID-19, are from wild animals, the wild animal markets, okay? Now, the Europeans and Asians domesticated animals. They drank their milk. They ate their meat. So the New World people, they didn't do that. They didn't domesticate animals. In fact, the only animal actually that was ever domesticated in the New World, llamas were domesticated in South America, but they didn't eat their meat so much and they didn't drink their milk. They just, I think they took their wool. That was about it. Now, stay with me here because you think I'm going off target here and thinking, okay, what does all this have to do with COVID-19 and how men are all created not quite so equal? Stay with me, please, here, because this is all important. So please, please, please pay attention. New World people, they were actually very healthy and they were very clean compared to the Europeans and the Central Asians. Okay? That's a fact. They really didn't have disease that jumped from animal to human. They just had human-to-human diseases, which aren't so bad. The bad diseases, the decimating diseases throughout history have been the ones that jumped from animal to man. The New World people did not domesticate animals, so they were very clean, very healthy. They didn't have that problem. They ate a very clean and healthy diet. Basically, They picked stuff off of the ground or off of bushes and trees. Some farmed a little bit, and they killed a wild animal every now and then and ate the meat. That was it. They were very clean, healthy lifestyle. They were kind of like they had the paleo diet. They were basically like hipsters. They ran after animals and ate meat. Okay, basically they were CrossFit and stuck to a paleo diet, okay? So they were the hipsters of the day, if you want to say that. But they had absolutely no immunity to Central and Asian people's diseases, Central Asian people diseases, okay? In fact, years and years and years ago, say some 10,000 years ago, the steppe invaders did the same thing to the Europeans. Now, who were the steppe invaders, you ask? Well, they were the people from... They were actually Eurasian nomads from Central America, or Central Asia, I should say. They were the nomads, the Mongols, the Huns, the Tartars, the Turks. And if you ever notice, most Europeans, the French, the Italians, some of the southern Germans, okay, some of the Eastern Europeans from the Balkan nations, aren't like the Druids or the Scandinavians. They're a bit darker skinned. They're a bit darker haired. That's because these steppe invaders that went into Europe basically took over Europe and intermarried with the native population at that time and kind of took over because they had horses. And the European farmers did not. Now, they also had bows and arrows, so their warfare was a lot more. But they had immunities to diseases from horses that the European farmers did not. In other words, just like the Europeans going into South America, sure, they had superior weapons, and they killed the population and whipped them into shape. But they also hamstringed the population because they spread disease to the European farmers, the early European farmers, the Druids, etc., that they didn't have. So they hamstringed the population, then defeated them, and thought this is pretty good, and they just stayed, okay? They also, because they did things differently than the European farmers. European farmers, the whole family farmed, okay? But they just farmed substantive farmers, okay? Now, the Mongols, the Tartars, the Turks, the men didn't farm. The women and the children farmed. And that left the men to do other things. They had all kinds of leisure time. So what did they do? They formed armies and superior weapons, okay? That's how they were able to defeat the early European farmers some 10,000 years ago, okay? Plus, they had the antibodies to the diseases from horses, similar to the Missouri Indians and the smallpox incident, okay? Now, wide distribution of Indo-European language is another indicator, okay? Because basically everybody in the world speaks a Indo-European language, okay? In fact, the only non-Indo-European language in Europe is Basque. That's because those people were kind of protected by the Pyrenees Mountains, okay? Were never invaded by the Tartars or the Mongols or the Huns or the Turks. Central or Southeast Asia, consider this. Once upon a time, Southeast Asia was occupied by the Aboriginal people from New Guinea and Australia, okay? In fact, if you ever notice Vietnamese, Filipinos, Indonesians, they're Asian people, but they're much darker. Now, sure, they're closer to the border than Southern Chinese, but not that much closer than, say, Hong Kong. Take Hong Kong and Vietnam. The people look much different. That's because many of the first ancestors of Southeast Asia were the Aboriginal people from New Guinea. But again, they didn't domesticate animals. When the Chinese arrived with their domesticated animal diseases, many of the Aboriginal people just died. And that's why people look more Chinese than they do Aboriginal in Southeast Asia. Let's go to Africa. Until about 2,000 years ago, most of sub-Saharan Africa was not populated with black people. It was populated by pygmies and the Caucasian peoples. And they're not really black. They're a darker color, but they're not black, okay? But they were hunter-gatherers, okay? They just, if they saw something, they picked it up and they ate it, or they hunted small game, okay? They were a small people. They weren't a powerful people because they didn't eat that much food. It's hard in the Transvaal to try to get enough to eat and grow big and strong. The West Africans, however, were farmers. They did domesticate animals to a certain extent. So when they advanced into the rest of Africa, the Aboriginal people of most of Africa, the Khoisan and the Pygmies, had no immunities. And that's why, because the West African farmers who domesticated animals and they spoke the Bantu languages, that's why most of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa now, speak Bantu languages, and they were a black population. Same as with the Europeans, because the West Africans domesticated animals and had those antibodies and immunities. The Bantus and the Pygmies, they did not. Now, farming and domestic livestock, they also make for more food, better food, and more leisure time to do things like assemble armies, okay? If you're spending 13 to 17 hours a day just trying to find enough to eat, like a hunter-gatherer would do, like the native peoples of North and South America and Africa and Pacific Islands did, you don't have much time to create an army. If you have leisure time, what does man like to do? Make things bigger and better. Improve the weapons. Learn to ride a horse. Turn a spear into a bow. Invent gunpowder, etc., etc. Okay? So that was the other way that these people who were farmers and livestock domesticators were able to run slipshod over that population who were just hunter-gatherers, okay? Now, thank you for your patience, because here I go now into why COVID-19 is the same thing, only different, and it's not treating everybody the same. Now again, COVID-19, like SARS, like MERS, like all the rest of them, jump from animal to human. Sometimes animal to human. In fact, almost always from animal to human. That's just how it works. Okay, that's how Blood Black Death worked. Rat to flea to man. Okay. Bat to snake to man. Okay. Bat to civid to man. Okay. It's one of those two things. But again, SARS, MERS, etc. came from wild animals, but they didn't come from domesticated animals. They came from wild animals. They came from wild animal markets where they had all these wild animals stacked on one another, bleeding and peeing and pooping on one another. Then they butcher them and they feed them. They use these wild animals for luxury meats. They use them for traditional medicines. In Africa, AIDS was from bushmeat. Bushmeat is a popular thing for many Africans to eat, okay? Now, the West, my friends, have no immunities to these diseases. Why? Because we don't eat bushmeat. We don't have wet markets. We don't trade, handle, eat, or use as medicine wild animals. Now, here's the interesting fact. Consider this. Consider this. Until this practice stops, more diseases like this are going to affect the West, because we're not going to eat snakes and civits and bats anytime soon here in the West, but they do in China. Now, Chinese and other Asians, they eat these wild animals. They use them as medicine. So do many Africans also. And the rate of infection and death is much lower in these countries and regions. Why is that? Could it be because these peoples, because they've been exposed to these wild animal markets, because they eat bush meats, because they eat civets and bats and snakes and use them as medicine, they have a partial immunity and a partial immunization because they've been around this stuff for a long, long time. And the fact is the rate of infection and death is much lower in these countries and regions. That's a fact. And again, I think it could well be due to the antibodies and immunities that these people have because they've been exposed to it. Now, consider this. You say to yourself, well, Strong, you know what? You say we don't eat wild animals in the West. Actually, some people in the West do. They hunt squirrel, they hunt deer, they hunt rabbits, they hunt birds, and they eat them. Now, people in New York don't eat them. People in the city of St. Louis don't eat them, but people in the rural animals do expose themselves more to wild animals.